Hello, my name is Julia HEBBRECHT. I'm working on a PhD thesis on the subjects optimizing land use allocation and matter fluxes in France for minimizing environmental impacts of agriculture. I work jointly at the INRAE laboratories Ecosys and SADAPT in the Paris area under the supervision of Benjamin Loubet, Francesco Acatino, and Drea Silvia Massad. My PhD subject was funded by the Sealand Convergence Institute, and my work contributes to Sealand Challenge number 1 on land-based climate mitigation. I will start my presentation with some elements of context and define my research question. Then I will present the datasets I'm using and my modeling approach. And finally, I will outline the perspectives of my model. So, to start with, I will present some elements of context. Since 1950, there has been a significant increase in agricultural yields. In particular, during the period 1970 to 2010, global cereal yields doubled, with values rising from 1,600 to 3,030 kilograms per hectare. Concerning livestock production, there has been a 1.4-fold increase in the numbers of cattle, sheep, and goats, a 1.6-fold increase for pigs, and a 3.7-fold increase for poultry. One factor that enabled this increase in agricultural yields was the development of global fertilizer use. During the same periods, 1970 to 2010, nitrogen fertilizer use increased by 233%, with values rising from 32 to 106 megatons per year. One consequence of the development of industrial agriculture was the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. In 2010, nitrous oxide and methane emissions from the agricultural sector accounted for 5.2 to 5.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, which corresponds to 10 to 12% of global anthropogenic emissions. On this slide, I will present you the main sources of nitrous oxide and methane emissions from the agricultural sector. This bar chart stems from IPCC 5th assessment report. It shows three major sources of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, namely agricultural soils, enteric fermentation, and manure management system. Each color bar corresponds to an estimation of emissions from a given database. If we look at estimations from the FAO Stats database, represented by dark blue bars, we get the following numbers. Enteric fermentation accounts for 32% of emissions in the agricultural sector. Agricultural soils for 27% of emissions, and manure management systems for 7% of emissions. I conduct my study at the scale of France. Within France, the special unit I use are the small agricultural region. It is a regional scale that is defined by the French Ministry of Agriculture. At this regional scale, I studied two types of land use, namely livestock production and crop and fodder production. I defined two concepts, which are complementarity and competition. An example of complementarity is the case of manure, because it stems from livestock production and is then used in crop and fodder production. And an example of competition is the choice of land use allocation, because land can either be allocated for crop and fodder production or for livestock production. And the question raised here is, how is it possible to minimize environmental impacts of agriculture through different strategies of complementarity and competition? So, I have defined the following research questions. First question, how can agricultural production be sustained to meet food needs while limiting environmental impacts? And the second question, how can land use and land management scenarios be optimized in order to soften trade-offs between agricultural production and environmental impacts? Now I will quickly present you the data sets that I'm using. The data on livestock production stems from the EFES expertise. It covers the time period 2010 to 2012. The special scale is France, with SAR, Small Agricultural Region, as special unit. I consider 5 livestock species in total, namely cattle, pigs, poultry, goats, and sheep. And the dataset contains information on feed intake and animal products. The second dataset contains information on crop and fodder production. It stems from Agreste and RPG, Registre Parcellaire Graphique. It uses the same spatial scale and contains information on 15 cereal crops, 5 oleaginous and 5 leguminous crops. It also contains information on 15 fodder systems. I use 2 main variables, which are the yields and the surfaces. Now I will present you my conceptual model. The central element of my conceptual model is the agricultural system that I divide into 3 compartments, namely livestock production, crop and fodder production, and grasslands. I study matter fluxes between these compartments. I also look at the nitrogen cycle, from nitrogen inputs to emissions and impacts on soils. One main objective of my model is to estimate ammonia, nitrous oxide, and methane emissions from the agricultural system. I also look at some nitrogen fluxes in soils, such as nitrogen sequestration. Now I will present you the schema of my conceptual model. Like I said before, the agricultural system is divided into 3 compartments: livestock production, crop and fodder production, and grasslands. I study matter fluxes between the compartments, as for example feed and crop residues that stem from crop production and are directed at livestock production, and manure that stems from livestock production and is directed at crop and fodder production as organic nitrogen inputs. I also study emissions of ammonia, nitrous oxides, and methane from all 3 compartments. And I look at nitrogen fluxes in soils, namely nitrogen storage and nitrogen leaching and runoff. Now I will present to you more precisely one module of my model that I have built in Python. The objective of these modules is to quantify ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions from manure management. I've built this module at the scale of 1 livestock species and 1 SAR. The starting point is the total nitrogen intake that is calculated from the animal diets. Then this nitrogen is partitioned between the manure management system and pasture, according to the time spent in each. So we will first look into nitrogen in the manure management system and the resulting emissions. There are 2 steps in the manure management system: housing and manure in treatment and storage. I use a mass flow approach to estimate ammonia emissions, so I partition nitrogen into a TAN compartment and a resulting organic nitrogen compartments. During housing, there are ammonia emissions occurring from the TAN compartments, and during the step of treatment and storage, there are both ammonia emissions and nitrous oxide emissions occurring. Then the remaining manure from treatment and storage will be applied on fields. Here I also made a distinction between tan and organic nitrogen. And at this stage of application of manure on fields, both ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions occur. Now we will look at the second path, which is nitrogen deposited in pasture, which only applies to ruminant species. Here I also applied the mass flow approach. Both NH3 and N2O emissions occur. Now I will present the approaches I used to estimate NH3 and N2O emissions. To estimate NH3 emission from manure management and from pasture, I referred to a study by Sommer et al. That estimates revised emission factors based on a large database. Then, to estimate N2O emissions from manure management and from pasture, I referred to IPCC 2006 report. So I use an approach with emission factors defined by manure management system. Now, if we look at emissions from field-applied manure, I estimated NH3 emissions using the empirical ALFAM model. And I estimated N2O emissions using results of the No Gas 2 projects conducted by the CITEPA and Terre Innovia. Finally, I will point out the perspectives of my model and the next steps. So the first step concerns the model I have built. I'm going to define different land use and land management scenarios, which consider both livestock production and crop and fodder production. And then I will estimate the environmental impacts from each of these scenarios. And the second step will be to implement an optimization approach. And the objective will be to determine which scenario of land use and land management optimizes the trade-off between agricultural production and environmental impacts. Thank you for your attention.